Now let's write an object-oriented dialog window class. I create a new empty bbj source file and call it my dialog, and start with an empty class body, class public my dialog. You may already have noticed that bbj does not enforce the class name inside a source file being matching to the source file name, but of course it's a good best practice that we all have learned from our Java or other language development experience. So now, since we're this time writing a class, we do not declare the variables with the declare verb, but we want to add them to the dialog as member fields. So we start with a field to hold user input. Our dialog class should take an input string from the user, and we say in this case field public bbj string. We want to just benefit from the comfort of bbj adding the getters and the setters for us, and the variable should be user input $. Now let's allow the developer to set the user input from the constructor of the class. We introduce constructors with this sample. A constructor in bbj, as in Java, has the name of my dialog and no return type. So just method public my dialog, and it takes the user input as a variable. So we call it here init value, and then inside we just say user input equals init value, and we have to close our method signature with method end. So let's assume we do not want the developer to use our class without giving the initial value, so we want to force him to use this constructor. The way we do that is by adding another one and making it private. So I do my method private my dialog, and since this one is now private, it cannot be invoked from outside, and the developer is forced to use our new class with the constructor and explicitly giving the init value $. Now let's add one more method to show the dialog on screen and to take the user input. We want this method to return the input when the user hits the OK button that we're going to render on the window together with an input field. So in this case, we want to make it return the string directly, and it does not take any parameters in the signature, but it needs a name called show. What we need to do is create a window, add an input field and a button to the window, and then when the user pushes the button, we want to return the contents of the input field back by this method. The way we do that is we first define a few more fields. They should not be public because we do not want the outside world to mess with our internal implementation. So we want to have a bbj top level window. We want to have a edit box, and we want to have a button. So now let's start as we learned before. The syntax is similar, just that we now would refer to our variables as member variables, which means we need a pound sign. We start with the window. Pound sign window. And now I'm chaining the commands you learned last time. bbj api.open sysgui x0 at window, and we put it somewhere in the middle area of the screen. We make it 400 wide and 80 high, and we give it a headline, your input. Now let's add the edit box and the button. Similar. Add edit box. And here we can initialize the edit box with the user input variable that has been set by the constructor. Now we finish by adding a button. Oh. And here we just write OK on the button. So what do we want to do now when the button is pushed? When the button is pushed, we want to simply use the user input as a return variable. So in this case, we register an event .set callback on button push. And in this case, we want to just remain inside the show method. So what we're doing here is basically we encapsulate the type of program we learned before inside the show method. So we say OK as a label. And then we can just say process events. Now when the user hits the button, we're searching for the OK label, which we introduce just behind the process events. We can say $INP equals edit box dot get text. And then we just say method read $INP. So now from the outside world, we can start using our input dialog. So the way we do that is we start declaring it. We just call the variable DLG, and then we say DLG equals new my dialog. And remember, we force the user to give an initialized value. So we say input, and then we can just say print dialog.show, because the show method returns directly the user input. Let's see if you made everything correctly. Here's our dialog. We have the input. I can override it. And here's the return to my program. Now in this sample, we again have used the label like in our first very simple scripted programs. Now I will show you how to use a method to receive events with that callback. For that purpose, we want to add additional logic so that the button is disabled when the user input is empty and enabled when it's not empty. So for that purpose, we say edit box.set callback, and then what we need here is the bbj API.on edit modify event, which is fired whenever the content of the field changes. And now, since we want to go to the instance of the class, to the object, we work here with the this operator, and we introduce a new method on input changed. So now what we need is we need a method called on input changed that can be called when the set callback is executed. Event routines in classes always need to be public, and they have no return type. And here we have the name. And they receive an event object, which in this case is called bbj edit modify event. And the nice thing about the event object is it gives us as a payload, in this case, the new value of the field. So we can just say, and then make it again in a verbose fashion, value $equals event dot get text. So the get text contains the new value of the field. And then we say if b $ is empty, then, and then we're gonna just disable the button. So if it's empty, we don't want the button to be enabled, and otherwise we enable it. Of course, we could have used an IFF or another Boolean expression here. I just wanted to be, for the sake of clearness, be verbose with my code. We run it again, and now you see when I make the field empty, the button gets disabled. And now when I enter something, it gets enabled again. And there we go.